Show me one sign of your favor, and I will show mine to Mozart.
Milos Forman's adaptation of Peter Shaffer's Amadeus is a love letter to the art of the theater, musical composition, and storytelling. It is, without question, a cornerstone of a nearly bygone era and method of filmmaking. The set design, sweeping and intricate in its detail, creates the perfect backdrop for a twisting narrative of a man completely consumed by envy and his delusion of thwarting God, being forced to watch as his life's work and accolades fade further and further into obscurity with each passing day, while his bitter rival is immortalized in the annals of history, serving as the main punishment for his sins. Now, obviously, the real-life Salieri never had any desire or scheme to murder Mozart, but people to this day still cite this as an argument for why this somehow completely undermines the film, as if bringing up the fact that Peter Shaffer used a rumor that was circulating around at the time as a what-if scenario for the basis of Amadeus is a valid criticism for the film not being completely historically accurate. God forbid a work of historical fiction use fictitious elements in its story. And while Mozart's substance abuse and crass demeanor were rather exaggerated in certain scenes, Amadeus never presents itself as a biopic of Mozart, rather using an iconic composer and his work as a narrative device to illustrate the two's dynamic in the story and to effectively resonate with the audience, as we are shortly about to go over. However, I figured I would clarify a couple of things before immediately diving in. Those of you who've been with this channel for a while will probably know that I've already covered Amadeus before in the past, and while I still stand by 99% of what I said in my initial video, I'd like to think I've gotten a bit better at this whole YouTube thing since my first stab at it, and have reached a point where I'm more equipped to give this film its proper due. Secondly, I'll be using the director's cut for the main basis of this analysis, seeing as it provides more context for Constanza's disdain for Salieri towards the end of the film, and the extended opera scenes are a feast both visually and musically, though it does in turn introduce some moments that don't massively harm the internal consistency of the writing, but are still rather out of place or unnecessary at times, possessing, as some might say,
too many notes,
which I'll further elaborate on later in the video, though broadly speaking I would still argue that both versions are worth watching. Regardless, with all of that now out of the way, let us delve into the madness of Amadeus. The film violently sets the tone at the very beginning by blaring the main overture for Don Giovanni, juxtaposed with an elderly Salieri lamenting in the night over his long-held guilt, which catches the attention of his caretakers where they overhear him essentially confessing to his crime before attempting to take his own life. This opening conveys so much, not just for what it establishes in the very next scene, but with its subtle foreshadowing given that Don Giovanni is the opera that Salieri uses as the main inspiration for his scheme, to keep Mozart in a perpetual state of grief and torment, emphasizing the central recurring theme of man versus God. Where we're then presented with the opening credits sequence, darting back and forth between Salieri being carted along the harsh, snow-trodden streets of Vienna to a lavish ballroom of guests dancing at a gala, highlighting a stark divide between the social classes, and in the same breath establishing that this was once a world he belonged to and thrived in. In terms of Salieri's wealth, he still would to a certain extent, but after tonight the social stain of the rumors that would circulate from all this will forever linger over him. This is fully realized when a priest visits Salieri in a psych ward the next morning, wallowing in his self-described mediocrity with a melancholic melody ringing throughout the room from his forte piano, serving as a painful reminder that his life's long devotion can no longer bring him the level of fulfillment and longing that it once had. Salieri is a man trapped in the past, yearning to live another day as the man he used to be before having met Mozart, and haunted with the reality of what his revenge against God ultimately afforded him in the end.
Can you recall no melody of mine? I was the most famous composer in Europe. Here. What about this one?
Yes, I know that. I'm sorry, I didn't know you wrote that.
I didn't. That was Mozart.
The man you accuse yourself of killing.
You've heard that?
The venom in his voice with that reply is so palpable, realizing that his deepest, darkest secret is no longer safe, all the while not denying the rumor outright. Perhaps his own sense of pride not permitting him to refute it, or no longer seeing the point given the short amount of time he has left on this earth.
For God's sake, my son, if you have something to confess, do it now. Give yourself some peace.
Where we then begin Salieri's confession with a flashback of sorts, contrasting his upbringing with Mozart's and establishing his early love for music being hindered by an unsupportive father. Out of desperation, a young Salieri turns to prayer and vows to be an instrument of God if he were to be made a great composer.
After I die, let people speak my name forever with love for what I wrote. In return, I will give you my chastity, my industry.
This sequence does a tremendous job of laying out how much of a prisoner of circumstance Salieri was growing up, and also emphasizing just how essential this vow Salieri makes is for his characterization and the arc he will end up going down later on in the narrative. On the other hand, we're also given our first glimpse of how skewed Salieri's moral compass truly is when he describes his father's death as
A miracle.
believing that God had clearly arranged everything to create a window of opportunity for him to pursue music, and in a short amount of time getting the royal appointment as Emperor Joseph's court composer. That all of this is a sign of his covenant with God, yet never weighing that his prayer and aspirations, at least under his own line of reasoning, are also indirectly responsible for the death of his father. Salieri is a man captured by his own delusions, and we're given numerous examples of this throughout the film. The inciting one being Salieri recalling his first encounter, so to speak, with Mozart. He cannot abide that this dirty-minded creature crawling on the floor is capable of composition that conveys phrases of such delight and unfulfillable longing. That such a crude and foul-mouthed person could be, at least to Salieri, an instrument of the Lord, and dismisses the piece as nothing more than a fluke, though not entirely denying the brilliance of the piece's overall structure, dynamics, and phrasing. In most modern productions, exposition is often used as a crutch for bad writing, resulting in very unnatural dialogue between characters, and in many cases creating more damage to the plot than actually fixing anything. But exposition in itself is not a bad thing. In this scene, Salieri isn't just describing the structure of the movement to the priest. We, as the audience, are given a glimpse into how Mozart's music resonates with him. It not only helps deliver a crucial plot development, but provides meaningful characterization for Salieri that's reinforced with the film's implementation of the score. The topic of Mozart's work carries over into the following scene where, after being informed of his musical prowess, Emperor Joseph posits the idea to his advisors of commissioning an opera from Mozart for the National Theatre. However, this in turn creates some contention as to whether or not the opera should be in Italian or German.
I think it's an interesting notion to keep Mozart in Vienna, Majesty. It should really infuriate the Archbishop beyond measure.
You are cattivo, court composer.
This bit of dialogue does an excellent job of cementing Salieri's political savviness. While his inclination leans towards Rosenberg's stance on the matter, it would also put himself, to an extent, in direct opposition of the Emperor, and decides to expertly abstain by diverting the conversation and appealing to Emperor Joseph's motive for bringing Mozart to Vienna. It also refocuses everything back to the thing that secretly piques his curiosity the most, whether or not the music he had heard that evening actually was a mere accident.
This piece had to be an accident. But had to be. It better be.
After the meeting, we then cut over to Salieri later that day, charting out a welcome march for Mozart's arrival. Not so much as a kind gesture for a potential new contemporary, but out of obligation, hoping that this piece will serve as an acknowledgement of his covenant with God and regain his favor.
Can I try it?
Majesty.
Delightful court composer. May I play it when he comes in?
I've always loved that last bit of having the Emperor of Austria asking his court composer permission to perform for Mozart as he enters the room. He's clearly aware of his own limitations and tends to defer to someone more versed in music. It perfectly illustrates how willing he is to break away from some of the typical conventions of royalty, despite commanding such a regal presence throughout the film, and displays the level of respect he has for Salieri. And this reveals just how much of an unreliable narrator Salieri can be at times, because while the Emperor does botch the march on his first couple of attempts, it doesn't take him too terribly long to eventually get a grasp of it, and with a bit more practice beforehand, he very likely could have performed the whole thing flawlessly. The Emperor's musical ear may not be as disciplined and refined as Mozart's or Salieri's, but he's certainly no slouch.
Actually, the man had no ear at all.
Salieri refuses to give credit where it's due to anyone he deems to be beneath Mozart on a musical level, including himself. This is ever apparent when Mozart is asked to perform the Welcome March after claiming that he already has the whole thing memorized after only one hearing, and even starts embellishing on top of it, creating both a callback and a massive tonal shift from the previous scene.
Grazie, signore.
And the thing is, Mozart isn't even aware of just how combative and abrasive he's being during this exchange. None of this is done out of any animosity or feud he has with members of the court. He's desperate to no longer be in service to the Archbishop, and in the moment doing anything he can to create a lasting impression with the Emperor, eagerly wanting to carve a different path from the one his father meticulously arranged, but still receive his approval for it at the same time. This unattainable desire is the central conflict that Mozart struggles with throughout the entire narrative. Leopold does want his son to eventually conquer Vienna through music, but explicitly on his terms.
I'm sick to death of it! We can't do anything right for you, can we?
On a completely different note, I actually wasn't aware of this until somewhat recently, but while Tom Hulce never performed on the soundtrack, he still insisted on learning every symphony in the film and would spend 6 hours a day practicing piano for months before filming in order to nail his hand placement during his scenes.
The only music is being played in a tiny little transistor in my ear. The keyboard is silent. I'm looking away so that when you lose your bearings, you can't find it because you can't hear anything. So it truly was a kind of schizophrenic situation.
Getting back on track though, Salieri views all this as a slight from God and questions whether or not this is a sign of unrequited love, or possibly a lesson in humility.
All I ever wanted was to sing to God. If he didn't want me to praise him with music, why implant the desire, like a lust in my body, and then deny me the talent?
Except none of this is true. Salieri didn't necessarily want to sing to God. Or at least that wasn't his primary motivation, contrary to how much he's convinced himself otherwise. Salieri asked for God to make him immortal through music.
Make me famous through the world, dear God. Make me immortal.
And despite just how self-serving a vow that was, God gave him everything he could have ever wanted and in abundance. He studied in Europe's most illustrious musical city, lived a life of luxury, mentored royalty, achieved the highest honor his station could afford, and still it was never enough. The reality is, Salieri is just as vain and arrogant as Mozart, though much more covert about it. He holds himself on a higher moral pedestal from everyone else, and because he believes all musical talent and ability is a gift from God, the prospect of Mozart being his better not only shatters his inflated ego, and eventually his relationship with God, but it leads him jumping to an entirely incorrect conclusion, that this somehow diminishes his talent entirely. He falls deeper into this existential crisis when we're given our introduction to Caterina Cavalieri. She represents unrequited love, or lust depending on how you view it, and one he cannot fully pursue even if she were taken with him, but in spite of all that is still rather possessive of her and cannot bear Caterina expressing her romantic interest for anyone else, least of all Mozart.
What does he look like?
You might be disappointed. Looks and talent don't always go together, Katharina.
Looks don't concern me, maestro. Only talent interests a woman of taste.
To a certain degree, Caterina is also consumed by greed and is infatuated with the potential of being courted by Vienna's newest promising musical composer. Also, the way the film transitions from her entertaining the idea of seeking out Mozart to the opera house scene is so masterfully done, using this vocal warm-up to create a sense of tension, until finally ascending to the note that she holds in the abduction from the seraglio. It's a really powerful narrative device that perfectly illustrates her desire of There's just so much to praise when it comes to the opera house scenes, from the level of detail put into the sets, costume and wardrobe designs, the choreography and performances from all the actors, but I think the main thing that really ties all of those elements together, aside from the music, is actually the lighting. Most, if not all the lighting you see in the theater scenes is actual candlelight and glow from firepots or lanterns. Milos Forman insisted on using natural light, lining the entire Estates Theater in Prague, the very same opera house Mozart premiered Don Giovanni at, with open flames to authentically replicate what attending an 18th century production would have been like.
I think this fact, gave a lot of humility and respect for that place to every actor and every dancer and everybody there.
During the first opera presented in Amadeus, the elder Salieri at one point describes a certain section consisting of ghastly scales, whizzing up and down like fireworks at a fairground. Now at first glance, that comment may seem like it's made purely out of spite, or an emotional reaction from having his darling girl stolen from him, but I'm not so convinced that's the case. Throughout the movie, Salieri never denies the quality of Mozart's work, even during moments where he would greatly benefit from it.
What did you think of it yourself? Did you like it at all?
I thought it was marvelous.
Is it not good?
It is miraculous.
And what did you think of the music?
Extremely clever.
I tell you, you are the greatest composer known to me.
I think the ghastly scales line, while having some level of bitterness behind it, is still an honest critique he has with the opera, because even the Emperor at the end of the performance shares that same sentiment, though isn't quite capable of articulating it.
Well, occasionally it seems to have
Too many notes, Your Majesty.
Exactly. Very well put.
Too many notes isn't just tossed in for comedic effect, but to emphasize the central conflict between artistic innovation and conventional taste. While the Emperor is the Emperor, he and his courtiers still represent an audience that either fails to fully resonate with Mozart's work, or view it as a threat against the current institution of accepted norms and traditions.
I think I'm right in saying that, aren't I, court composer?
Yes. Yes. On the whole, yes, Majesty.
This is absurd.
There's a double meaning with Salieri agreeing to the Emperor's feedback, because while it is a valid observation that he can piggyback off of to further his interests, it's also an admission to himself of how overwhelming Mozart's musical prowess is, serving as a crippling reminder of his own deficiencies and further feeding into his inferiority complex.
My dear young man, don't take it too hard. There are simply too many notes. That's all. Just cut a few and it'll be perfect.
Which few did you have in mind, Majesty?
Prior to this moment, we've seen instances of Mozart either being totally oblivious or having a dangerous neglect for political tact, but it's prominently put on display during this exchange. From his perspective, what started out as him eagerly seeking the validation of royalty unexpectedly turned into the Emperor insisting for cuts to be made, suddenly being tasked by someone who is not remotely an authority on music to alter his score, and naturally, Mozart lacks the temperament and tact to properly deal with what he believes to be an invalid critique or complaint of his work. We'll be sticking a pin in that last bit for the time being, though, because it'll become extremely relevant very soon. However, after Constanza's mom announces her daughter's engagement to Mozart, and fangirls over the Emperor, this is where we get our first major addition from the theatrical cut, and one that I think is an overall improvement. While there is an implication in the original that the two of them had some sort of fling, there's nothing there to necessarily indicate that they had slept together, whereas the dressing room scene has Katerina scolding Mozart and removes any doubt that, as Salieri puts it,
The creature had had my darling girl. It was incomprehensible.
Plus, if we're going off the theatrical cut, then that would mean that everyone on that stage who saw Katerina hit him with the bouquet, including Constanza, would have realized they hooked up as well, rather than Constanza writing her off as some self-obsessed diva who's mad at her mom for stealing her big moment with the Emperor. Of course, nothing else comes of this, given that Katerina most likely doesn't want to potentially ruin her professional and social reputation, along with everything else that would come attached with revealing their affair. But not long after all this, we're given a scene of Salieri being introduced to the Emperor's niece, and mentions that he's looking for a music tutor for her, and is considering Mozart for the position. Salieri manages to talk him out of it by suggesting that he wouldn't want other composers to accuse the emperor of favoritism, and that it would be best if a council were to confirm the royal appointment, displaying just how much influence the Italian faction of the court has with the emperor. Where we then immediately cut to an angry outburst from Mozart in the Chamberlain's office. There are multiple layers to their conversation. On the surface, we're shown the full extent of Mozart's pride and arrogance, scoffing at the notion of the emperor entertaining anyone else for the position, least of all having his work judged by musical idiots. Then you have the Chamberlain simply laying out that if he wants to play ball, then these are the rules he must adhere to. A game that Mozart recognizes as a rigged one, given that the entire council, with the exception of maybe Kapellmeister Bono, are saboteurs of his, and refuses to submit his work amongst his colleagues. And while that decision is made with legitimate concern, it also results in putting him and Constanza in a rather desperate situation. Speaking of which, a few days later, Constanza arrives at Salieri's manor with samples of her husband's work to be considered for the royal appointment. At first, he tries to search for any means of getting out from looking them over immediately, but inevitably caves when he discovers that they're all originals.
I was staring through the cage of those meticulous ink strokes at an absolute beauty.
Milos Forman has often described Mozart's music as being the third character, and it's perfectly exemplified here, having the score sporadically change as Salieri frantically flips through the pages to fully deliver on how caged-in Salieri feels on a creative level, possessing the means of recognizing musical genius, but condemned to only appreciate it from afar, reveling in the ecstasy of an absolute beauty and cut down by the agony of his life's devotion not being rewarded with this divine gift. And it is here where Salieri's crusade against God begins.
Thank you, Your Excellency, thank you.
Come back tonight, alone. It's a post all Vienna seeks. If you wish it for your husband, come tonight.
Many have argued that he ultimately made this offer to Constanza, presuming that she was a respectable woman and would refuse, serving as a way to keep his campaign against Mozart a secret while scoring a form of petty revenge against Mozart. But once again, I don't necessarily think that's the case. Salieri is still clearly livid with Mozart for having stolen his darling girl away from him, and is convinced after combing through the samples that God didn't honor his vow, so why should he continue to hold up his end of the bargain? It's a proposition made out of defiance that he very quickly regrets having made, desperately pleading later that evening to God to gift him with one piece of music as a sign of his love, only to interpret his servant announcing Constanza's arrival as his prayer having been refused. He can have Mozart's wife, but God will never grant him the same level of musical talent. Of course, I think the main reason for Salieri sending her away was due to having never been with a woman before, but there's still a combination of resentment and shock of Constanza being willing to debase herself for a husband who was not only disloyal to her, but someone who Salieri deems as being unworthy of such devotion to begin with. There's a considerable amount of people who view the restored dialogue and added scene between Salieri and Constanza as unnecessary alterations that bog the pacing down, but I simply couldn't disagree more. We're given proper context for Constanza's disdain for him towards the end of the film, when she insists on kicking him out despite having taken care, quote-unquote, of her sick husband.
He needs me, ma'am.
No, he doesn't. And I don't want you here. I regret we have no servants to show you out, Herr Salieri.
And these additions also give another level of depth to Constanza. She genuinely wants the best for Mozart and is grateful for how much he pours into his work. However, he's not exactly practical with the money that he does earn and is desperate for any means to help further his career, winding up being coerced into sleeping with Salieri, seeing no other alternative, only to have the door immediately slammed in her face, feeling as if she's betrayed her husband and ruined his future prospects. Having something that doesn't massively facilitate the plot doesn't mean it's not worth having in the narrative, and the theatrical cuts that were made with Constanza's scenes do limit her characterization in the film. However, after humiliating her and ordering his servant to see Constanza out, we get the iconic monologue of Salieri not losing faith in God, but declaring war against him, swearing to hinder and harm his incarnation as far as he's able, because as much as it pains him that he would choose such a lusty, smutty, and boastful creature to be his instrument, he cannot refute the divinity in Mozart's music, which only fuels his resentment even more, leading him to champion a new life's devotion.
I will block you. I swear it. I will hinder and harm your creature on earth as far as I am able.
Now, as much as I laid out for why the previous editions that were made with the director's cut were necessary changes from the theatrical, the same can't really be said about the ones that follow immediately after the fireplace scene.
I have to tell you, Mozart is not entirely to be trusted alone with young ladies. As a matter of fact, one of my own pupils, Maria Teresa Paradis, told me she was molested, Majesty.
This seems a bit out of place for Salieri. Not that he wouldn't invent and spread a rumor/accusation like this around, but I don't think he would do it so brazenly, especially to the Emperor. Every interaction with him before and after this exchange has always been much more tactful. Not to mention that he name drops one of the supposed victims, creating an opportunity for this to get disproved if the Emperor made the effort to go verify this. Granted, given his history and influence with Emperor Joseph, one could argue that Salieri knew this would be something he could spin and easily have him believe, so it's not like this massively harms the internal consistency of the writing. It's just a little odd that he's so direct here. Also, while the piano lesson scene in itself isn't bad, it doesn't tell us anything about Mozart's personality and demeanor that we aren't already aware of at this point in the story. So I think if you were to cut everything from the accusation to the music lesson scene, it would trim a little bit of the fat off. Then again, when you factor in that all this is about 5 minutes worth of material, it's not like leaving those scenes in drastically changes the runtime or anything. They're just bits that I find to be somewhat unnecessary. Moving on though, we jump back to Mozart being greeted by his father, who's made an unexpected visit. There's an interesting dynamic between the two of them, with Mozart warmly welcoming his dearest dad, and Leopold, upon seeing the state of his son's flat, is concerned about his financial situation, asking probing questions as to why they don't have a maid. Because while he represents a rather controlling and somewhat unapproving figure at times, it's evident that Leopold still wants what's best for his son. However, seeing a window to avoid further difficult questions and conversations, Mozart insists that the three of them attend a masquerade that Salieri, by pure chance, just so happens to be tending in disguise.
Mozart, why don't you name your son's penalty?
I want you to come back to Salzburg with me, my son.
Papa!
I'm tired of this game. I don't want to play anymore.
I love the depth of that last line. He isn't just fed up with the game he's currently being subjected to, but Mozart's stubbornness and impetuous behavior, of constantly having the allowance he offers him undermined at every turn, of all his efforts to improve his son's situation being wasted with such frivolous things, wishing that for once Mozart would honor his wishes, or at the very least take his advice seriously, and leaves defeated. Later on in the party, Mozart is taking song requests from all the guests, but turning down all the ones he finds boring, where Salieri asks him to play his music to get a true sense of what everyone in the room thinks of his work, only to have it mocked by Mozart and all the party guests, interpreting this humiliation as God laughing at his mediocrity through Mozart's obscene giggle.
One day I will laugh at you. Before I leave this earth, I will laugh at you.
And so he anonymously hires a maid to spy on Mozart and inform him of everything he's working on, eventually uncovering that his next opera is set to The Marriage of Figaro, a play that had been banned all over Europe for satirizing the current aristocratic class and challenging the status quo, creating heavy divisions within the socioeconomic classes, not necessarily being the main inspiration for the French Revolution, but serving as a bit of a precursor for it. And seeing an opportunity for this to hinder his bitter rival's career once and for all, he immediately reports this to the emperor, where once again Mozart tries to sway the court by appealing to his composition, rather than addressing the concerns about the possible political ramifications attached with his opera.
Why must we go on forever, writing only about gods and legends?
Because they do. They go on forever. At least what they represent. The eternal in us.
Unlike his detractors appealing to current conventional tastes to maintain their own status and egos, the Baron is rightfully warning him about the dangers of recklessly abandoning long-held customs and traditions associated with established myths and legends due to the enduring moral truths contained within them, such as the cautionary message over hubris and blind ambition found within the tale of Daedalus and Icarus, the dangers of greed embodied in King Midas, or if we're to go by a far more modern example, J.R.R. Tolkien's legendarium championing the ideal that there is beauty, decency, and goodness to be found in the world, and it's worth fighting for. There is merit in Mozart campaigning to persuade the court to allow a less divisive version of Figaro for the National Theatre, but his method of going about it and offhand remarks often land him in hot water. Though the Emperor is an incredibly patient man, and to Salieri's dismay, Mozart miraculously manages to secure the commission for his opera. Another one of his schemes foiled yet again. However, throughout the entire process to hinder his rival's opera, Emperor Joseph serves as a bit of a wild card at times. His efforts to remove the music for the ballet portion are thwarted, but this in turn puts him in Mozart's good graces, believing that Salieri actually had spoken with the Emperor to restore his play.
But there are those who have power over him. I think I'll take this up with the Emperor.
I don't need to tell you I said nothing, whatever, to the Emperor.
This victory is somewhat short-lived for Mozart, because a royal yawn is a death mark for any opera in Vienna, and as Salieri lays out, it's fortunate that the Emperor yawned only once. After 9 performances, the play is withdrawn, and Mozart furiously confides in his new colleague, asking him why more people didn't show up.
I think you overestimate our dear Viennese, my friend. Do you know you didn't even give them a good bang at the end of songs? To let them know when to clap.
It more or less goes without saying, but F. Murray Abraham is simply phenomenal throughout Amadeus, and flawlessly delivers the conflicted nature of this line. He loathes the prospect of giving any form of advice to Mozart, but can't resist the satisfaction of revealing that he knows something that he doesn't, that he does have something over him, as trifling as it may be. Regardless, Salieri asks Mozart to attend his concert, where after the performance, he asks Mozart what he thought of his new piece.
One hears such sounds, and what can one say but Salieri?
I love just how backhanded a compliment this is. It's vague enough to not be an overt insult, but completely empty as it doesn't actually praise anything about the music itself. Of course, Salieri already knows Mozart's true opinion of his work, but has to ask the question as a formality and smile through the jab to maintain the facade, inching ever closer to his goal. After the performance, Constanza breaks the news to Mozart that his father has passed away, in that moment realizing he never gained the approval he so longed to receive from his father, sending him into a spiral of substance abuse, late-night partying, and unbearable grief, made only worse with Salieri creating the right circumstances to torment him into working on the Requiem Mass, causing him to sink into such a state of depravity and madness that Constanza and his son are frightened to be anywhere near him, ultimately driving them away.
He drinks all day, then takes all that medicine and it makes him worse.
All of this culminates during the climax of the film, where after collapsing at the premiere of The Magic Flute and being brought back to his flat, Salieri lies and claims that his share from the performance is actually payment from the Man in Black, and that if he finishes the Requiem Mass by tomorrow night, he'll receive another 100 ducats. Of course, being in no state to manage that on his own, Salieri offers to help him finish the piece, putting himself in the proper place to carry out the final step of his grand design, and as close as he will ever reach to being able to put God's voice to paper.
Hands up to F on the second vocal?
Yes.
Yes.
And on dictus.
Yes.
And underneath, just violins, arpeggios.
This exchange is exquisite, both in terms of the quality of dialogue and the specific implementation of the score to properly contextualize to the audience what's being said on a musical level, eventually building up to a point of having the whole Requiem played, while Constanza makes her trek to Vienna out of guilt for leaving her husband alone, establishing another form of racing tension. However, after the two of them take a break from their writing session, Mozart delivers his final words to Salieri.
I thought you did not care for my work. Or me. Forgive me.
Here is a man he has tortured and driven to his deathbed, feeling remorse for his initial distrust of Salieri, and asks him for his forgiveness, a clear expression of his innocence and humanity, further noting the divine qualities Salieri believes Mozart's music has been endowed with, and in the moment also viewing this as a sign of being put in the position of absolving God's incarnation, in turn absolving God of what he deems to be a cruel slight against him. The tragic irony of all this is that not only was Salieri refused his grand crusade with Mozart passing before the Requiem could be finished, he's also denied the infamy he seeks with this confession 32 years later, with only a servant of the God he's blocked entirely actually willing to indulge him, That the rest of the public will brush all this away as nothing more than the mad ravings of a senile old man whose memory has clearly failed him, who believes that he speaks for all mediocrities, absolving them wherever he goes.
I am their champion. I am their patron saint.
With that said, if you've made it this far into the video, then hopefully you've enjoyed me gushing over one of my all-time favorites. I have some other projects in the works, but they're still a ways out from being finished. In the meantime, if you have requests for anything you'd like to see covered, then feel free to drop them down below in the comments. Otherwise, doing the usual algorithm stuff helps out immensely. Again, thanks for watching, and until next time.
Well, there it is.